No television series can claim the legendary fame of Star Trek. Today it can be seen in over 100 domestic markets and in over 40 countries worldwide. All this because of one man's vision. And Gene Roddenberry intends to continue the tradition in Star Trek: The Next Generation. As in the original series, Gene's aim is to produce stories that, while they entertain, will offer positive human messages that are relevant to today's issues.
There are a lot of issues and challenges in the 80s and 90s and the end of the century that need talking about. And they need talking about in drama, because drama will move people, will cause people to think, and much more than any straight show.
By Gene Roddenberry's own admission, Star Trek was not mere entertainment television. It had a mission, namely to spread modern progressive values through drama, and it has left an indelible mark on popular culture, inspiring millions and often shaping the minds of the Western world's most prominent thinkers and scientists. The episode where Stephen Hawking plays cards with Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton comes to mind. Then there's the fact that Carl Sagan, Francis Fukuyama, Michio Kaku, Lawrence Krauss, and Neil deGrasse Tyson have all cited and spoken fondly of the franchise. There's a warp drive in Dulles, Virginia, and NASA's first space shuttle was even named after the Enterprise. Many people are convinced that Star Trek invented the concept of the iPad long before Steve Jobs did, and Elon Musk in 2019 likened the launch of Space Force to the launch of Starfleet. The original series ran from 1966 to 1969 during the height of the Apollo program. It began 2 years after the Civil Rights Act and 1 year after the Hart-Celler. It very much reflected the cultural revolution those acts ushered in by implementing an interracial cast and placing women in prominent authoritative roles. But were it not for Star Trek: The Next Generation, launched almost 20 years after the original series was canceled, I would argue the franchise wouldn't have had quite the same widespread impact on the social landscape. Captain Picard made Star Trek a household name. The Next Generation was nominated for 58 Emmy Awards and took home 19. It was because of The Next Generation that 2 other prominent follow-up series were created: Deep Space Nine, which ran from 1993 to 1999, and Voyager from 1995 to 2001. Although less popular and successful, they still made quite an impact and carried ahead the progressive torch. Voyager placed a female lead in charge of a starship, and Deep Space Nine a single black father in charge of a space station. Even the very opening lines of The Next Generation aimed to, quote, boldly go where no one has gone before, whereas the original aimed to, quote, go where no man has gone before. It was a clear nod to feminism and, to a lesser extent, transgenderism. Consider here that Commander Riker has an affair with a genderless species, the Janai, and that Data's daughter chooses her gender. But the phrase is ironic because, while it set out for new progressive territory, Star Trek also set out to retread old ground, namely a plethora of Western historical events and social developments. As one Star Trek essay put it, quote, science fiction is not so much extrapolation of the future as it is a metaphor for the present, allowing its readers or viewers to gain the necessary distance from their own society and time, unquote. The Federation is, after all, a secular empire of Enlightenment values spreading out into the galaxy, much like American influence spread across the globe after World War II. Unlike the United States, however, Star Trek's Earth is a society of post-scarcity and social equality, an idealized outcome of where the free world would lead humanity. Even the Federation's emblem appears strikingly similar to that of the United Nations. Money and materialism are said to be things of the past. Tribalism has ceased to exist. Rather than identify with their national, religious, or racial origins, everyone simply identifies as human. But Star Trek hardly represents humanity as a whole. It uses a variety of mechanisms and plot devices to explore various European and Anglosphere historical settings. The holodeck is constantly employed to delve into the world of Sherlock Holmes, Shakespeare, and mid-20th century detective and crime novels. The film Star Trek Generations begins with Picard and his crew aboard a 19th century military vessel. The Doctor in Voyager is obsessed with Italian opera. Janeway spends time with Leonardo da Vinci and tutors the children of a 19th century English aristocrat. Benjamin Sisko has his entire crew play baseball against the Vulcans. Bashir and O'Brien reenact historic struggles such as the Alamo and the Battle of Clontarf. Picard engages in traditional horseback riding and visits the Orient Express. Worf and his son travel to the Wild West. Tom and Harry have several adventures fighting an evil scientist named Dr. Chaotica, whose world is clearly based off 1930s science fiction serials. As luck would have it, Tom is also an expert on 20th century combustion engines and has a passion for hot rods. Roddenberry sold the idea of the show to network executives via the premise of a, quote, wagon train to the stars. But again, this was mostly window dressing for an insertion of progressive values into an audience who grew up with comic books, hot rods, and caricatured notions of English and French aristocracy. For example, the Enterprise crew in particular is constantly engaging in classical European music recitals. Part of Picard's efforts to teach Data about humanity involves performing Shakespeare's greatest works.
Data, you're here to learn about the human condition, and there is no better way of doing that than by embracing Shakespeare.
Janeway does the same thing for Seven of Nine via Leonardo da Vinci's 15th century Florentine laboratory. Moreover, the Enterprise and Voyager have every modern conception of cultural refinement available to their crews. Aside from the champagne dinners, Picard paints live models, and Janeway even gets full body massages. The Enterprise is a posh 1980s liberal arts college with an 18th century aristocratic veneer. This likely forced the audience to draw certain associations between the more traditional prestige on display and the bolder values conveyed in the stories. Patrick Stewart was a fantastic choice in casting for this purpose. He exploited a lingering American reverence for the refined Englishman, something that is all but gone today. Picard, however, is nevertheless counterfeit. The historical captain of the Imperial Navy, the English scholar, writer, and explorer he symbolizes, most certainly did not share his more liberal views. But, again, his noble demeanor encourages the audience to draw the associations. The notion that the Enterprise represents the human condition, as Picard puts it when instructing Data, is rather arrogant, considering that it very obviously represents a vertical slice of the American perception of it in the late 20th century. For the record, I will not be addressing the other shows such as Enterprise, Discovery, Picard, or any of the films after Nemesis in 2002, nor will I be addressing any of the novels, at least not directly. My aim here is to elicit a discussion on how these 4 television series shaped popular culture during the 1960s, 80s, and 90s. Moreover, these 4 series constitute an immense amount of material, roughly 460 hours worth. If you were to watch them all back to back without stopping, it would take you 19 days. Suffice it to say, this has constituted a lot of work. Something else very important to understand here, especially for the younger audience, is that the original Star Trek came out at a time before the internet. There was no on-demand streaming, and there were relatively few television programs. This was still largely true in the 1980s when The Next Generation launched. Yes, cable and VHS had come about, and this detracted from network viewership, but Paramount Studios ran The Next Generation as a first-run syndication, which meant that a variety of networks broadcasted the program. The pilot garnered 27 million viewers, and its weekly episodes averaged between 8 and 11 million. In many ways, these shows were a social staple and a shared cultural experience. With this in mind, something I hope this work addresses is an untenable belief that the social problems we're currently facing are rooted in some recent series of phenomena circa 2015. People dissatisfied with the current state of affairs often express a nostalgia for the 80s and 90s and assert that if we could just go back to that time, things would be better. Without any doubt, the advent of the internet and social media have exacerbated the various ailments we're suffering. But Star Trek highlights just how problematic our worldview was in the 1960s, let alone 2015. We were already well on our way toward a society that lacked harmony and cohesion. We may be more erratic, conflicted, and disorganized today than we were in the 1960s, but the seeds of our undoing were well established back then. Star Trek was both an insemination of post-war values into society, as well as a reflection of post-war developments. It was a prime mover of cultural change and a consequence of what had already been set in motion. If I had to boil Star Trek down to its most primordial components, I'd label it as universal secular humanism, unhappily married to a sect of religious particularism. Now, perhaps that statement doesn't quite make sense right now, but with any luck, it will by the time you're finished with this series. For your convenience, I've included an outline of what will follow. I've tried to divide everything into semi-separate topics, but the franchise has a lot of repetitive and overlapping themes. So, at times, I will repeat an observation or address something out of its designated section because it's contextually relevant. I've designed this series to be watched in this particular order. Each section builds upon the last. Technically, you don't have to adhere to this order, but if you don't, you may miss out on pertinent information and framing. I sincerely hope that this series cultivates a broader discussion and reflection on post-war value schemes and the role of media in the post-war era, specifically science fiction. In our efforts to boldly go where no one has gone before, I do believe we have eradicated the foundation of what made us who we were. A quick addendum before closing this video out. Because of the nature of YouTube copyright policy, it may not be possible for me to upload and maintain my entire series here. I will do what I can, but for the time being, all 16 videos can now be viewed at the other platforms listed on the screen, and you can find the relevant links in the description.